Christmas Day 2006, I celebrated my 75th birthday. I had 75 years of life to reflect back on. As I looked back, I saw time after time where God took bad and made good come out of it, and where God spared my life. To really understand what brought me to this point, I have to set the stage. You need to understand, I did not know God at that time, but He knew me, and He spared my life over and over again and brought me to America, the promised land, where I came to know Him as my Lord and trust Him with my life. Chapter 1. Life in Russia. My parents were born in Russia in the late 1800s. They lived in the town of Novocherkassk, north of the city of Rostov. They lived on the southern frontier of Russia along the Don River, which flows into the Sea of Azov, which is part of the Black Sea. Dad was born here and lived here until he left for military school at the age of 18, from 1910 to 1914. There were Don Kazakhs. Don Kazakhs were known for their excellent horsemanship and for their fighting prowess. For hundreds of years they had been expected to defend the borders for the Tsars under Imperial Russia. By the end of the 19th century, the size of the Russian Empire was about 22,400,000 square kilometers, almost 1/6 of the Earth's landmass.
The Russian Empire, pre-Revolution Russia, was a state that existed from 1721 until the Russian Revolution of 1917. Imperial Russia was the predecessor of the Soviet Union. It was one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. At one point, in 1866, it stretched throughout Europe, Asia, and North America, the part that is now Alaska. However, at this time, the majority of the population lived in European Russia. More than 100 different ethnic groups lived in the Russian Empire, with ethnic Russians comprising only about 45% of the population. At the beginning of the 20th century, the only other empire to match Imperial Russia's size was the British Empire. Imperial Russia was ruled by an emperor or Caesar, called a Tsar. At the start of the 20th century, the Russian Tsar was the only absolute monarch left in Europe. Tsar Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov was the last emperor of Russia, King of Poland, and Grand Duke of Finland. He ruled from 1894 until his forced abdication in 1917. His official title was Nicholas II, Emperor and Autocrat of all the Russias. This picture of Tsar Nicholas II was taken about 1915. He was the last Romanov. The Romanov dynasty, or line, was started in 1613, and by expansion, eventually, the head of this dynasty became Tsar or Caesar over the Russian Empire. Tsar Nicholas was the only Tsar Gleb's parents ever knew. Gleb's dad met him in St. Petersburg and shook his hand, while Dad was an officer in the Tsarist army. Tsar Nicholas II was Tsar from 1894 to 1917. Gleb's dad took an oath as an officer to protect and defend the Romanov dynasty. This is Her Imperial Highness Maria Fyodorovna, wife of Tsar Nicholas II. They had 4 daughters and 1 son who was the youngest. The 4 girls were Anastasia, Olga, Tatiana, and Maria. Their little son Alexei had hemophilia and was frail and sickly. This is a postcard from that time showing the uniform worn by the Cossack regiment who guarded the Tsar's son, Grand Duke Alexei. This is another picture of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife. The printing in the upper center says Romanov. The Naval Review by Tsar Nicholas II and his only son, who had hemophilia. Rasputin was invited to live in the court to help the Tsarevich, the son of the Tsar, with his sickness. The Winter Palace of Tsar Nicholas II in St. Petersburg before the Russian Revolution. Gleb's dad was here on leave from the Austro-Hungarian front during World War I. This was taken on his leave in 1915. In front of the Winter Palace, the Tsar is reviewing the cavalry, artillery, and army units. This Winter Palace eventually became the Hermitage Museum. His Imperial Highness, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, brother of Tsar Nicholas II, during Tsarist times before the Russian Revolution, about 1915. Here, another Grand Duke, a brother of Tsar Nicholas II, is inspecting the troops. All brothers and sons of Tsars were Grand Dukes. This one was 6 feet 7 inches tall. He is facing us on horseback. Each Cossack family was expected to give one son who would join the military for his entire life to defend the Tsar.
Though my dad was one of 14 children, he was a son selected to serve. He was born on August 14, 1893. While still in his teens, grandfather sent him off with the family 2 best horses. He never saw his home again. He fought in World War I and during the Russian Revolution and ensuing Civil War. He fought against the communists. He served in the cavalry. He fought on horseback with lances, sabers, rifles, and pistols. During the last days of the Civil War, my father was badly wounded, and his men carried him over the Caucasus Mountain into Constantinople, Turkey, on a litter. This was the 5th time he was severely wounded. We have no pictures of Dad's family or of him as a child, but here he is while on the Austro-Hungarian front during World War I, probably in 1915. Dad is seated, and on either side of him are his adjutants. Each Cossack brought his own horse when he joined the army. My grandfather gave Dad 2 of the family best horses when he joined. Grandfather raised horses and wheat. Dad had 13 brothers and sisters. I'm unsure whether Dad had a choice in joining the military. I know that not every boy in the Cossack family had to join. Once they joined the Tsarist army, they joined for life. The Cossacks defended the frontiers, lived on the frontier, and had autonomy with the Tsars. For defending the frontier, the Cossacks were granted freedom and could elect their own leaders, who were called atamans. Dad, Vasily Ivanovich Bulanov, in his field uniform during World War I. He is wearing the same type of saber worn by the Tsar and the Grand Dukes. The fur hat identifies him as a Cossack from the Don region. This picture was taken in 1915 or 1916. This is a picture of Mom taken in Russia. Mom and Dad were married in Russia in 1914. Dad was already in the army. Mother, Maria Afanasyevna Chepelkov, was born on July 3rd, 1898. She was also from Dad's village. She had one sister. Here she is with her family in Russia, taken about 1910. She's standing on the right between her parents, who are seated. To the left is her sister and her sister's husband. This is the last photo of them together. In 1922, Mother received a letter from her mother. "You are the lucky one, you got away. Don't write to us anymore." There was no further contact. At that time, under communism, people were arrested in the Soviet Union and called enemy of the people if their family members had fled Russia during the revolution. If contact was made with those family members that had left, people were arrested for connections abroad. She never saw them again.
Dad married Mother in 1914 when he was already a military officer. He was 22. She was 16. Dad continued to fight on the Austro-Hungarian front against the German Empire during World War I. Germany, Austria, and Hungary were allies. Russia, France, and England were allies. In 1917, with the onset of the Russian Revolution, Russia pulled out of World War I because the whole country collapsed. Gleb's dad returned home to find the country at first under a democratic provisional government, but then, in a very short time, it was taken over by the communists. Tsar Nicholas II and his entire family were taken prisoner by the communists and put to death. The Tsar's daughters were grown, but none were married yet, when the whole family was killed by the communists. In 1918, the Cossack people, men and women, insurrected against the communists and started what is known as the White Movement, fighting of the whites against the Reds, which were the communists. This civil war ended in 1921 or 1922. At times it looked like the white unit would prevail, but in the end they were forced to retreat and were pushed into the Crimea and the Caucasus Mountains. During this time, Gleb's mother became a medic on the front lines. She had been severely wounded. A hand grenade tore up her right arm. During the last days of the Civil War, as the communists took over, she fled Russia by ship from Odessa to Constantinople. She had been on the front lines all this time, offering first aid to the wounded. Now, she and Dad were separated, and neither of them knew if the other was alive or dead. Gleb's dad had been very seriously wounded and was unconscious for a while. An artillery shell had exploded under his horse, blew his horse apart, and wounded him. He was carried by his men on a litter through the Caucasus Mountains, through Turkey, to Constantinople. This was a rugged, harrowing trip of hundreds of miles. His men could have left him to die. It would have been so much easier for them to cross the mountains without carrying him. But they would not abandon him. If they had, he would have surely died. When Dad's soldiers got him to Constantinople, they got him into a hospital. He was more dead than alive.